Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of the committee in 2020. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and any members using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they are turned to silent. We have received apologies today from Beatrice Wishart, MSP. The first item on the agenda is consideration of the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020 Remedial Order 2020, and I welcome to the meeting Ben McPherson, Minister for Public Finance, Migration, Lucy Carmichael, the Bill Team Leader, Ninian Christie, Solicitor, and Keith White, Lawyer with the Scottish Government. Members should note that the remedial order proposes to change the exception to the ticket touting offence contained within the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act. The proposed draft order is made under a power in Section 12 of the Convention Rights Compliance Scotland Act 2001. And this power allows Scottish ministers to make changes to legislation in order to remedy an incompatibility with rights protected by ECHR. An order making such changes is known as a remedial order. And I would like to invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today about the remedial order. Most committee members will be familiar with the discussion about charity auctions of match tickets that took place during the parliamentary process of the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020, but there have been some changes to membership since then, so I will briefly set out the background. At stage one, this committee supported the creation of an exception to the ticket touting offence for auctions of Euro 2020 match tickets where the proceeds are given to a charity. The Scottish Government gave effect to this through an amendment at stage 2, and this amendment was unanimously supported by committee members and is now section 3 of the Act. Section 3 currently provides that the exception only applies where the proceeds of an auction are given to a charity established in the UK or EU. Following further consideration, the Scottish Government now believes that this section is discriminatory, and so I have taken swift action to lay a proposed draft remedial order which broadens the exception to include charities established in any territory. The order makes a second consequential change to ensure that the charities which have the benefit of the exception to the touting offence will, if not registered in a charity register similar to the Scottish Charity Register, require to have charitable purposes and provide public benefit in ways that mirror those standards as provided for in Scots law. These changes will ensure that there are equivalent criteria for Scottish and non-Scottish charities alike, removing any scope for discrimination based on the grounds of the national origin or other status of the charity. I wrote to the presiding officer when the order was laid to set out the reasons I believed it was necessary. My officials have updated key stakeholders on this matter so that they have an opportunity to submit any views. A public notice has also been published on the Scottish Government's website inviting comments on the order. The period for written representations will end on the 28th of April 2020. To date, no comments have been received. I expect to lay the draft order as soon as possible after the period for comments ends. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thanks very much. And obviously we're very pleased that the bill was amended to include the exemption for charity auctions as a result of the committee's deliberations. Can I just ask which articles of ECHR does it violate?
So, following further consideration of the Act, Convener, as passed, we concluded that there is insufficient justification to limit the charities to the exception applies to comply with Article 14 of the ECHR, the prohibition of discrimination read with Article 1 of the first protocol to the Convention, the protection of property.
Okay, thank you very much. Do any other members have questions? Annabelle.
Convener, good morning, Minister and panel. It's a general question, if I may, which is, given this order today, and indeed we'll get on to the next SSI, relate to the underlying legislation that the Parliament passed. Okay, which provided for a special regime to facilitate the holding of the UEFA matches in Glasgow. What if the matches are postponed or don't go ahead at all? Presumably then the legislation, the underlying principal legislation is not triggered, which would mean that this order would be passed and related to the underlying act, but presumably the trigger would, what would happen as a matter of the legal position? Because obviously the legislation has introduced particular provisions that are to apply exceptionally in Glasgow, and if the reason for that is no longer there, what is the position vis-a-vis the legislation? Does it just not get triggered, or what?
Important question in terms of implementation of both the primary and the secondary legislation. I intended to say something more on the coronavirus in my opening statement on the next regulations, so I will say that in due course. However, I would say that if there were to be a cancellation and there is no decision made in that vein at present, we are proceeding on the basis that the tournament will go ahead and Glasgow will host the matches allocated. However, we would have to consider the point around would amendment to the primary legislation be required. I don't know if officials, do you want to come in more on that?
Well, yeah, as you say, I think it would depend what the position was. So I think if the event were to be rearranged for a different date, that would have implications in terms of the championship period, which, as you've said, is specified in the Act. I think it would still be helpful to have the ticket touting offence in force, because if the championship was being arranged, there could still be ticket touting of match tickets happening during that time period, but it's certainly something we would need to consider further. But as the Minister says, we're working on the basis the legislation will be required and we're progressing it.
And particularly with regard to the championship period and the cessation date, we need to take consideration of how, if amendment of the primary legislation would be necessary in that,
Thank
situation.
You.
Stuart.
Convener. Just it's on the issue of the ticket touting. So the convener asked a question regarding the relevant ECHR, but you stated earlier, Minister, regarding and you quoted following further consideration. What was the trigger point? What was the thing that happened or was highlighted to the government to actually then instigate this further consideration to make this change?
So, as the committee will be aware, there's a process after Parliament passes legislation when the Lord Advocate considers the legislation passed, and at that point it became clear to us that from that further consideration that the section 3 of the Act was not compatible with ECHR, and swift action was required, and I and my officials took that action as quickly as possible.
So it wasn't an issue prior to the amendments, but it only became an issue after the amended legislation?
Yeah, so all of us, the amendment that we passed together was deficient, and we need to rectify it by way of this order.
Okay.
Gordon.
So just to follow up on that, I'm not quite clear. So the bill was passed into an Act of Parliament, and then it was after that decided that this was incompatible with ECHR?
The particular section, yes.
The particular section. So in other words, the presiding officer had given the certificate prior to it being passed that it was compatible.
So do you want to come on that?
Yeah, so there was, and Keith might want to come in at some point if I, from a legal perspective. So there is an assessment of the policy and the competence of that policy at the point where all amendments are being prepared by the Scottish Government, just as a kind of working together on that as a team. And then following an Act being passed, there's a further consideration of the amendments in terms of competence, and it was at that point, following that further assessment, that this potential issue was raised. I think it would have been quite unlikely to have arisen, but having identified a potential issue, we then thought it was necessary to take steps to rectify it. Keith, did you have?
only thing I was going to add, I mean, the presiding officer's certificate relates to the bill as it's introduced rather than as passed, and this was added during the passage of the bill.
So what is the point of the presiding officer's confirmation of ECHR compatibility if one can simply amend and bring in incompatible things in the course of passage? Does it actually serve any purpose?
Keith, do you want to come in on that again?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the purpose of that is so that when primary legislation is introduced to the Parliament has an opportunity to debate the terms in which it's introduced and consider whether those there are any issues of human rights or other issues of competence with it. And then there's a separate stage at the end of a bill for it to be considered.
Okay, Oliver?
Thank you, Convener. I just wondered, I accept this amendment was unanimously supported and it had very good intentions. I just wondered on just a point of practice, before the Scottish Government supports amendments, does someone look from a legal point of view and decide whether or not they're compatible?
So, of course we do, and our legal division who have oversight over all amendments that the Scottish Government brings. This was a Scottish Government amendment that was brought to this committee to reflect the position raised by the committee, which the Scottish Government was agreed on, that an exception should be made for charity auctions from ticket touting offence. In this instance, on reflection, the drafting of that amendment was not compatible with ECHR, and the process of which we went through together as a Parliament did not manage to bring that to the fore.
They believed it was compatible at the time?
Yes.
Indeed,
Yep.
indeed. And just for clarity, of course, in the Scottish Government, we are reflecting on the fact that this has happened, and will be further enhancing, we'll be considering whether to further enhance our processes in order to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Thank you.
Can I ask, was this flagged up by UEFA itself? Was it brought to the government's attention by UEFA?
No.
Because I'm assuming that there are, I'm not an expert in this, but there are countries that play in the championship that are not in the EU, so they may well have charity auctions that would be affected.
This was not brought up.
It
by
wasn't
UEFA.
brought up. It was
brought
entirely something that you've
brought to
spotted
Scottish
yourself.
Government's attention by the evaluation of the Lord Advocate.
Sure. Okay.
And of course, the timetable for this bill was not ideal, and we all accepted
Yeah.
and expressed that during the process
Yeah.
at stage 1, 2, 3. But as I said, we are reflecting on the fact that this happened, and are doing, by bringing this order, taking swift action to resolve and correct this.
Okay. Thank you. Claire?
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, there's a degree of uncertainty about the Championship at the moment, and I do appreciate the Minister describes it as swift action, but the 60-day period for consultation followed by 40 days for affirmative procedure, does that mean the legislation, the remedial order, won't be effective until around mid-June? And do you expect any impact from that either for Scottish charities or the other countries' charities which are brought under the remedial order? Would that have an impact on Scottish charities who want to auction tickets before mid-June? Or
The ticket touting offence will not be brought in until this has been corrected. So the period for comments, as I said, ends on the 28th of April, and then we realistically expect to bring both the offence and with the order in mid-May, which is the time when UEFA are anticipating issuing the tickets. So we're seeking to make sure both the correction and an effective offence are in place for that point. Lucy, do you want to come in on that?
for mid-May, you expect them to be in place, is that it?
So absolutely, a standard affirmative procedure would be a further 40 days. I think what we would be keen to do is work with Parliament to see whether it is possible to expedite that process so that the offence can come in sooner. But obviously that would be subject to working with Parliament on that.
And you'd want to bring the offence in so it times with when the tickets are available for sale, which is anticipated to be mid-May, is it?
So tickets, there have been a number of sales tranches of tickets. However, UEFA has indicated that the actual tickets themselves won't be distributed until towards the end of May. Right. So we think that limits the scope for ticket touting to take place in advance of that. But of course, we are also working to put out messaging that if people were to buy tickets, although the offence isn't in force, they wouldn't be committing an offence. But it wouldn't be wise to do so because they would be likely to be refused entry at the stadium. So we think that that will discourage, hopefully, people from buying tickets in the interim period before the offence is in force. But as I say, the tickets are not available yet. UEFA says it won't distribute them until the end of May.
Important to reiterate at this point that the decision on whether to permit a transfer of a ticket in these circumstances still lies with UEFA, yeah. Even though that we've put the exception in the primary legislation, and through this order we're correcting it as we've discussed. But if a charity auction takes place and there's still a process, and we've done our part and we'll continue to do our part to raise awareness of this, there's still a process that's required where the charity needs to contact UEFA in order to facilitate that process.
Right, okay.
Stuart, did you want to come in on this? Yeah.
Supplementary, thank you. Lucy, you just mentioned there about working with the Parliament to try to introduce this quicker. I would assume, therefore, that discussions are underway with the presiding officer's office and others, and to try to make this happen. Because I'm asking the question because I also sit on the Delegated Powers Committee, and also this order did come to our committee a couple of weeks ago, and this particular issue wasn't raised as an area of concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been some discussions at an official level, and we were waiting until after the discussion about the order had taken place today to make a more formal approach to the presiding. Yeah.
So from what I'm picking up from what you're saying here, there is the potential. There's more potential for ticket touting to take place now because of this oversight than there would have been before, if the bill had gone through and it hadn't been subject to this change.
UEFA have indicated that match tickets in all formats, as I said, will not be available until the end of May 2020, which I think reduces the scope for touting before the offence is expected to be in place. It reduces it, but if there's no offence, then there will be more ticket touting than there would have been otherwise. The potential for more ticket touting than there would have been otherwise. Well, first of all, UEFA has indicated that it will distribute the majority of tickets through a ticketing app that will be available for download at the end of May, and it is anticipated that this app will prevent the replication and duplication of tickets, which will have an effect. I do recognise that attempts to tout tickets might be more likely after the full match draw is known at the end of March, but we have made clear in the messaging that we have been sending to stakeholders that tickets are non-transferable, and therefore people buying touted tickets may be refused entry. And I think this will help deter people from buying touted tickets. But as I said, also we are, through this order, seeking to remedy the issue with ECHR in terms of Section 3 as quickly as possible, in order, and working with the Parliament in order to be able to bring the offence in as close to and seeking to, if we can, before the issuing of tickets in May 2020.
Yeah, well, that would certainly be preferable. Claire?
But so it's just to be clear, but you can still buy tickets before May. You could still, you won't physically own them until May when they start to issue them, but you can still buy tickets.
Yes. And
does the remedial order, so what's the difference in time? Was there then an original intention to introduce the ticket touting offence earlier than what we're going to be able to introduce it because of the remedial order?
Correct. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. Thanks.
Do you want? Did you want? No.
Right. So I assume that the affirmative will come back to the committee for consideration.
Do you want to see on the process then?
So,
No.
so I think that's part of the discussion we would like to have. As I understand, there are a couple of different processes that could follow. So that's something we would like to discuss further with Parliament.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. We now move to agenda item 2. And agenda item 2 is consideration of the draft UEFA European Championship Trading and Advertising Scotland Regulations 2020. The Minister for Public Finance and Migration and his officials are also in attendance for this item. Members should note that the regulations are laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve them before the provisions can come into force. Following this agenda item, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion and to approve the regulations. And I'd like to invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Just on the first instance, in terms of the impact on Euro 2020 with regard to the coronavirus, I'd just like to state to the committee that advice in relation to major sporting and cultural events and other mass gatherings will continue to be guided by expert scientific advice. Event partners for UEFA Euro 2020 in Scotland are in regular dialogue with us in the Scottish Government and others. The official statement from UEFA at the moment is that UEFA is in touch with the relevant international and local authorities regarding coronavirus and its development. And for the moment, there is no need to change anything in the planned timetable. The issue will be kept under constant scrutiny. And in the Scottish Government, of course, we continue to evaluate the situation, and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport will update Parliament again later today. All of that considered, we are continuing to proceed on the basis that UEFA Euro 2020 all going ahead promises to be a unique and spectacular event, with 12 cities and countries co-hosting the championship for the first time in its 60-year history. And the benefits of bringing the third biggest sporting tournament in the world to Scotland will be significant, not just for our economy, but for our international reputation too. Subject to parliamentary approval, the trading and advertising regulations will help ensure successful delivery of the championship by meeting UEFA's requirement for the protection of commercial rights. These regulations provide of the trading and advertising offences and provide details of the trading and advertising offences and, importantly, exceptions to these offences. Maps and dates of the operation of the event zones are also included in the regulations. When considering these regulations, a proportionate approach was taken to ensure the right balance between minimising any negative impacts on local businesses and allowing them to take advantage of the economic opportunity the championship represents, while protecting rights of UEFA and event sponsors who have often invested significant funds for the right to be associated with the tournament. This balance has been achieved, for example, by limiting the number of event zones to 3, minimising the size of these zones and creating a number of exceptions to the advertising and trading restrictions. The regulations are in the main consistent with illustrative regulations that I shared with the committee in October, which were in turn based on the equivalent Glasgow Commonwealth Games regulations. The illustrative regulations were also shared with our event partners, Glasgow City Council, Police Scotland, the Scottish FA and UEFA, as well as a number of other key stakeholders, including the Advertising Association, the Police Federation, football supporters and community groups. We're grateful to these partners who have helped shape the draft regulations and periods of restriction. Indeed, suggestions from this committee to include exceptions for busking and charity collections have been welcomed and incorporated. I believe that the UEFA European Championship Trading and Advertising Scotland Regulations 2020 strike an appropriate balance between allowing normal business activity to continue as far as possible while protecting the rights of UEFA and event sponsors. Subject to parliamentary approval, confirmation of the regulations will allow Glasgow City Council to proceed with publication of guidance, another key milestone in raising awareness of restrictions among businesses and traders ahead of the championship and ensuring successful event delivery. I look forward to answering any questions that the committee may have on these regulations.
Thank you very much for that. I've got a couple of questions to open with. If you could maybe say anything more about any feedback you might have had from businesses on the illustrative regulations that were published during the passage of the Act. And I'd also like to reiterate the committee's welcome for the exemption for busking, which was highlighted during the parliamentary process. The exemption for charity workers is not as clear-cut as the exemption for buskers. Regulation 4 includes this as a trading activity which is to be restricted, and the policy note states that it's expected that certain charity collectors will be permitted to collect in event zones in a controlled way to manage numbers. And I just wondered whether you could tell us who will determine which charity workers are permitted to operate and how they will decide what constitutes operating in a controlled way.
Thank you, Convener. So, yes, there has been feedback. We received feedback about, for example, how much advertising and trading would be affected by the restrictions and potential costs to businesses. However, we also heard from some businesses that the impact of the charges was likely to be minimal. The changes was likely to be minimal, for example, hotels. And we received feedback from the Advertising Association, who liaised in considerable correspondence with officials who shared a few minor comments from its members, but nothing too extensive. Overall, the feedback has been that the exceptions are welcome, that the impact will be proportionate, and that there's been lots of engagement with a variety of stakeholders, as mentioned in my opening statement. So we've received good feedback, and that has been considered as these regulations have been refined. In terms of the charity workers, any charity collector who has been granted permission by Glasgow City Council under the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982 will be allowed to collect within the 3 zones. Glasgow City Council will manage the number of charity collectors in all zones through this permission process. And we understand from the Council that some charities have begun to make contact about collections during Euro 2020 already.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do any other members have questions? Annabelle.
Peter, turning to the 3 zones, so Merchant City, Hampden Park, George Square, I just wondered, following the Act itself receiving royal assent, what engagement has there been on the part of the Scottish Government, or if you're aware, Glasgow City Council or Glasgow Life, with businesses which are situated within these 3 zones? Has there been further engagement with these businesses?
Thank you. Important question. When we discussed in the process of the bill as well about making sure that we spoke to those who would be affected. There was significant engagement has taken place over several months. There have been 2 drop-in sessions held earlier this week on the 10th and the 11th of March at Hampden Park, Glasgow City Chambers, to seek views on Glasgow City Council's draft guidance, which is being drafted to provide details of the regulations to businesses, traders and advertising associations. This also provided an opportunity to ask questions about the restrictions. Invitations to attend these sessions were sent to elected members in the Anderston City, Yorkhill and Langside wards, Merchant City and Trongate and Mount Florida community councils, selected publications, nightclubs, selected media, inventory owners, businesses in George Square, Merchant City and Hampden Park vicinities, and 75 street traders as well, both static and mobile licence holders. So significant engagement. A contact point was provided for these businesses that could not, for these businesses and for businesses that could not attend, so that any further questions can be considered. And the Scottish Government also updated stakeholders such as the Advertising Association and football fan groups when the trading and advertising regulations were laid, to ensure that they were kept informed of the process. So significant engagement in recent
Absolutely, Minister, very significant engagement indeed. I just wonder if you're in a position to update us on the alternative arrangements for the street traders who would normally operate within those zones, and indeed how many permits will be available. And if you don't have that information to hand, it would be helpful if you could let the committee know in writing.
Yeah, so there has been engagement, including this week. So some traders only operate within the Hampden Park campus, and there is no permitted trading within George Square or the Merchant City. So Glasgow Council has updated us on the number of current licences in the Hampden Park zone. There are currently 75 GCC licence holders in this area. The Council previously indicated 113 licences in August 2019, so there's been a reduction. And in addition, Police Scotland has indicated that there are around 23 peddlers licences which allow traders to operate in this area. But it's for Glasgow City Council to make the offer to the affected traders. That was what we put in the primary legislation and we passed together. We look forward to Glasgow City Council doing that in due course.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Do any other members have questions? Claire.
Thank you, Convener. One is a general question, Schedule 4, the Euro 2020 product categories. I'm assuming that is set out by Euro 2020, that you don't have any influence over what is included in the categories. I don't understand why white goods are in there, fridges and freezers. I don't know why that's on the list, but I take it you don't have influence over the list. That's a prescribed list.
We don't. We obviously had significant discussion on this. I'll bring officials in a moment, but of course, one of the things we were very determined to do was make sure that we had exceptions as possible within this that would, with regard to product categories, so that product categories that are not included are not affected by the offences. So we've tried to. That's part of our proportionate response. Lucy, do you want to say any more?
Not a huge amount, just that yes, as the Minister says, these are the product categories that were suggested by UEFA, and we've obviously engaged with UEFA just to make sure that we're clear about what falls under them and that they're as clear as they can be to people reading them. But yes, they are UEFA's categories.
Because they are quite odd, some of them. Fridges and freezers and associated parts for motor vehicles. And I don't know. But anyway, that's fine if that's... the other thing I was going to ask about was when we took evidence on the bill at the time when we talked about ticket touting, and there was a degree of frustration that we can only give a limited period of the legislation. We can't produce comprehensive ticket touting legislation, and part of that is because it's a mixture of reserved and devolved responsibilities. But at the time the Minister said he would look at the possibility of a framework bill, and I wondered if any progress had been made on that, and whether it would still be yourself who had a change of ministerial responsibility who would be responsible in this area.
So there hasn't been further consideration of that at this point, but of course I did commit to that within the process, and I think it is something that we should consider in terms of future events and seeking, if we can, to do things, and if it's right, to do things in a more comprehensive manner. Responsibility for this at ministerial level sits with the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Fair Work and Culture. She leads for the government. Fiona Hislop, MSP, leads for the government on major events, and it would be at her discretion and direction as to whether to how to proceed on that basis.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do any other members wish to ask a question? Okay. We now move to agenda item 3, which is the formal consideration of motion S5M 21118, calling for the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee to recommend approval of the draft UEFA European Championship Trading and Advertising Scotland Regulations 2020. And I would remind members that only the Minister and members may speak in this debate. And I invite the Minister to speak and to move this motion.
Formally moved, Convener.
I now invite contributions from members. I now invite the Minister to sum up and respond if you wish.
Just urge committee to pass the regulations.
Okay.
Thank you.
The question is that motion S5M 21118 in the name of the Minister for Public Finance and Migration be approved. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. The committee will report on this instrument in due course. And I'd like to invite the committee to delegate authority to myself and the Deputy Convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Okay. We can now suspend the committee briefly. Agenda item 4 is an evidence session with Screen Scotland, followed on from our meeting last week when we took evidence from a panel of stakeholders on the performance of Screen Scotland in the context of recommendations made by the committee's report on Screen, which was published in June 2018. And can I welcome to today's meeting Isabel Davis, who's the Executive Director, and David Smith, who's the Director of Screen Scotland. And I'd like Isabel Smith to make a short opening statement. Apologies, Isabel Davies.
That's all right. We are joined at the hip now, it's fine. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And first, I'd very much like to thank the committee for inviting us to give evidence this morning. David and I are really ambitious for Scotland and are working at production speed to ensure that we seize the opportunities. The committee will be aware that this is a boom time for global production, fueled by the rise of the streaming platforms and an insatiable appetite for high-quality content, whether on TV or cinema screens. Now is indeed the time to be developing Scottish companies, writers, directors, producers and crew in order to participate in this boom and ensuring that Scottish-led content has its place on those screens. Working as a partnership allows us to do more and faster. Screen Scotland draws upon the valuable expertise within Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland. Based at Creative Scotland, we benefit from the organisation-wide support services, the complementary expertise from our colleagues in the arts and creative industry teams, as well as stellar strategic leadership from Ian Munro. We operate through continual engagement with the sector and the wider market, and our support and interventions respond to current needs. We are conscious that as a young, developing organisation, we have been building our own expertise and skills within the new team, evolving the way we are organised with more specialist roles. We are growing to become a well-resourced, expert-led, specialist screen development body, augmented by the expertise and specialist advice available through our partner agencies and supported by the expertise and leadership of Creative Scotland. We are looking forward to telling you about the many achievements towards our objectives since we last met and to be able to report strong progress on the studio in the Port of Leith. We were delighted to be able to announce the appointment of First Stage Studios to run the studio, which is now available and functioning as a production facility. This is a hugely significant milestone, growing capacity beyond that of our existing studio facilities and infrastructure across Scotland. We have outlined further progress in our submission and will be pleased to discuss this further with the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Can I say that the committee also welcomes the progress in terms of the announcement this week about the studio in the Port of Leith. We called for a studio in our report, so we're very pleased that that announcement has been made. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background to the site selection process and the rationale for picking Palamis as the National Scottish Studios? And can you also tell us why the announcement was made this week?
Certainly. Indeed, the committee called for the studio, and I think it's fair to say that everyone has recognised that the need to grow capacity was going to be a priority for Scotland in building growth. The site was selected after, frankly, a fingertip search of Scotland to find a facility that met the requirements of studios, and there are a number of factors involved in that. It's to do with the specification of the building itself, needing as it does to respond to the size and height of particular buildings that are required for those large-scale productions that we know that we need to attract. It's also to do with the proximity to rail and transport links, and indeed to location sites which tend to complement those kind of large-scale film studio and high-end TV series that one sees today on many of those channels. Our team at the Screen Commission looked across Scotland. They looked on the west coast and the east coast, and frankly, on discovery of the site in Leith, it was clear that this was a real gift to Scotland. The building is so much more than your average distribution warehouse, which have been the backbone of many conversions across the UK. This is a very exceptionally robust structure. It has incredible dimensions, and it's in a site that not only responds to all those other requirements around proximity to travel and transport links, with the proximity of crew, but it also has around it the space for further development. And I think it's fair to say that we're all very excited about the further possibilities of creating a creative cluster or hub to respond to that additional growth that the studio will bring. We are certainly mindful, and if indeed the search continues for further sites, we're aware that high-end TV and film, those large-scale productions aren't the only type of production that's going to allow Scotland to grow. We're very, very conscious that there are other market demands, and we're very conscious that there are other sites around Scotland that may come onto the market, and we remain actively engaged with those conversations on other studios as well. But we certainly felt that this was the site, and it came out of a report that did an option appraisal on a number of sites, bore down on 2, and there was a 5-stage process, a 5-stage business case that looked at all the economic and strategic factors that in the end made it a clear winner.
Thank you very much. You'll be aware that we took evidence from stakeholders in the industry last week, and one of the things that they were saying was that the location in Leith wasn't optimal in terms of getting crews, because most of the crews were based in Glasgow. Would you like to specifically respond to that point?
Thank you. It's actually good to have an opportunity to respond to that. I mean, it's certainly true that 65% of the crew base is on the west coast, which leaves 35% on the east coast. And I think it's fair to say that we as Screen Scotland are here as a Scottish agency, and we know very well that the ability of Scotland to take advantage of that space is also going to be reliant upon our ability to grow our skills base, that's for sure. We have already put in the last couple of years about £4 million towards skills development, and we're going to be working closely with the operators of the studio to further build the opportunities. I think Ward Park's a fantastic example of how that can work, looking at the way in which we were able to build skills programs across the last 5 and now 6 series of Outlander to grow skills through the production process itself. We all know that that's the way in which crews will develop and progress, is through doing. And that really is the most effective way of growing our skills base. In addition, we do believe that there are very strong transport links, so that's another reason why we feel that it won't be impossible for many crew to come and work from the West Coast. Furthermore, we're also aware in many of our conversations with the industry, both on the East and the West Coast, there are many people who want to come back to Scotland. We know that we have world-class crews, heads of department, directors and writers. They're not all living in Scotland right now because they haven't been able to build a sustainable career here. They are very excited about the possibilities of bringing more production into Scotland that will allow them to come home. We're aware that 35% of the crew on Game of Thrones came from Scotland. Let's have them back.
Absolutely. Can you tell us how much work needs to be done on the studio to make it fit for purpose and how much it will cost?
Yes, indeed. So the studio is a fully functioning production facility right now. Productions are looking at it as is. Screen Scotland has put £1 million towards the initial refurbishment of the building and the setup and running costs of that building. As I mentioned, it's a very robust structure, but it has been left empty for 15 years. So there are initial works that need to take place, including building and safety and compliance and such like, that will allow it to be used initially. The further refurbishment of the studio will take place according to the demands of those production clients. We're in a very good position, we think, indeed. I mean, I speak for the operators, but it'd be very nice to hand over to the operators now, that they will be looking at what those clients require and will work with the grain of that client need and market forces as those projects progress. There will be private money coming into it, and we stand ready and we have a plan, if necessary, to put further public support into that alongside private funding.
Okay, and I take it it's big enough for a number of major productions to use it at once?
Well, yes. I mean, the eventual plan for now is that there will be 5 sound stages. There are certainly discrete spaces right now, so it's certainly true that, dependent on the scale of the productions, many productions, well, a handful or a small number could use it and could cohabit at any given time. In addition to the stage space itself, we have 27,000 square foot of office space, production workshop space as well, so it's possible that something could be shooting while something else is constructing. Yes, that's certainly.
And can you give us any hints as to what we might see being filmed there?
I'm sorry, I can't for now, because we have a number of clients who've expressed a strong interest, but we would always be beholden to the confidentiality around those productions. But we're very excited about what we will be able to announce. And I think we all know that that's going to be the next major milestone, that to see a large production in that building.
Details on when you might be making an announcement, or when the operating company might be able to make an announcement? If we had known this, we could have asked him last week when he was in front of us. But
Indeed. I'm sorry, I wouldn't want to sort of speak on their behalf right now in terms of those timescales.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a supplementary from
Yes, thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. It's just about the issue of the studio, because as you pointed out yourself, 65% of the crew are in the West, and there's already a strong economic focus on Edinburgh as opposed to the West of Scotland. So this will, of course, increase that, but it will only increase the greater focus on Edinburgh if, in actual fact, production companies use this facility in Leith. And you probably will have seen the evidence by Eric Coulter last week, and he basically said, look, we filmed most of Rebus in Glasgow because the economic cost of actually taking crew from Glasgow and having them overnight, never mind the transport links, it's the time it takes to actually get from Glasgow to Edinburgh, meant that production would have been uneconomic and unable to actually deliver in Edinburgh. And what he said was that they could actually just use a soundproofed shed for a fifth of the price of Leith, over in the West. And so my concern is, for Indigenous Scottish companies, it seems to me you're pitching at your Outlanders and these big once in a lifetime type productions or once a year productions or whatever, rather than Indigenous companies. Because what we heard very strongly in evidence last week was that there's a real difficulty in small Indigenous Scottish companies getting started. So how will Screen Scotland, given that the decision's already made in Leith, support Scottish Indigenous companies from the West and elsewhere to be able to make full use of that Leith studio, given the cost of crew from the West? Because I don't particularly want all the crew to move to the East, and I don't think many of my colleagues will either. And address issues such as the time it actually takes to travel through. How will you square that economic circle? Because it's a real issue.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack in all of that. One is the fact that this is an opportunity in Leith, but it's not an opportunity just for Edinburgh. It attaches to the Borders, the Lothians, to Fife. And there is a substantial crew base across those areas. They do travel to Glasgow regularly for work currently, and won't be required to do that at the same point. There has been some discussion about the need for overnight payments to be made for people coming from the West Coast to the East Coast. As evidence was presented last week, that doesn't happen in reverse. The crew travelling from Edinburgh and the Lothians and the Borders to Glasgow do not get overnights for travelling to their work base in Glasgow currently. So there is a mobile workforce across Scotland. The kind of companies that you're correct in pointing out, the kind of companies that will access Leith generally are going to be larger, but not exclusively. There are potentially 5 stages there. There's a variation of size. So different companies, different productions can access at the same time. We also have a range of studio facilities across Scotland. I joined Screen Scotland in November from industry. This is my 3rd month in the job. I was really fortunate in the first week to kind of have a tour with visitors from the States to Ward Park, to the pyramids in Bathgate, and to Bath Road. And Bath Road was exponentially bigger than the other facilities because it just is a unique shed. It's not replicatable anywhere else. And if we want to attract those productions, those bigger large-scale productions into Scotland, that's the best building for those. But it's not the only option. Ward Park is fully occupied at the moment by Sony, and we expect that will continue. But there's the Dunmartin facility. There are other facilities we're looking at within Glasgow and the surrounding area. I have meetings next week with, potentially I have meetings next week with people coming from outside of Scotland to view different sites across Glasgow. For different sizes and shapes of productions. Shiny floor shows, as we call them, entertainment shows, don't require something as big as Leith, and there are spaces across Scotland that could be utilised. So we're looking at that. We're looking at different solutions for different productions and different levels of company. It's also not, I think part of your question from memory was about do we support smaller companies? And we support every size of company. I was really intrigued by some of the evidence last week talking about the high growth and that we go for high growth, and that's just simply not the case. High growth is part of our strategy, but it's not all of our strategy. And actually production is part of our strategy, but it's not all of our strategy. And if you look at the kind of range of companies, even supported through something like the Broadcast Content Fund, which is a fund directed, it has a strategic aim at to double the turnover for the sector in Scotland. If you look at the range of companies, I can list them happily. There's Solus Productions, Sorbet, Hello Halo, Blazing Griffin, Hopscotch, Two Rivers, Happy Tramp North, Caledonian TV, STV, Mara Media, Montrose Pictures, True TV and Film, run by Barbara Orton, who you heard from last week, and Arabella Page-Croft referenced a £4 million commission that she'd recently secured. That was supported by us through development. We helped them get that commission, and we will support it through production.
Facts remain, though, that the production in Scotland is less than 2% of the UK's production in terms of value, and Indigenous only a fraction of that. So we're talking about fairly fledgling industry relative to other parts of the economy. My concern, obviously, is that what will happen over the years is that we'll see more and more crew relocating to Edinburgh, which will diminish what we have in Glasgow. There's already an east-wide divide in Scotland economically, as you're probably well aware. But I'm thinking about how will Indigenous companies be able to afford to hire the space, which was an issue that pointed out. Mr. Coulter said it could cost, now you may be able to correct us on this, but he said it could probably cost 5 times more to use the shed, use the studio in Leith than it might be to hire a shed with 4 soundproof walls somewhere else in Scotland. So I think that if that is the case, then that clearly will mean that some productions, unless they have financial support to do so, will not be able to use the Leith studios as perhaps they could or benefit from as they should.
I mean, if I may respond to that, I think it just simply isn't within the creative process of most Indigenous productions, by which I mean UK production. productions to use a very large studio facility. Many of those projects will prefer to use smaller spaces that are closer to locations. Indeed, some of the interiors will be shot on location because it's a preference of those productions. So it's just a different model of financing. And I don't know that some of the productions that indeed, if you could use an alternative space, that's actually sometimes the creative choice as much as it's a budgetary choice as well. So I think it's horses for courses, honestly. And I think as David has outlined, we know that there are a number of facilities. We know there's more growth that's needed. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm very struck by the very low percentage that Scotland represents of that enormous boom right now. The figures from 2019 across the UK show that across 3.6 billion, which is 16% growth across the UK. That's we need to have a greater market share of that. But I think what we're talking about there is those very high budget productions. Meanwhile, the number behind that is that across the UK, independent film production went down by 45%. However, in Scotland, it grew. So we're seeing other trends come through at the same time, including that the broadcasters are making good their commitment to their quotas. So that 8% from the BBC, Channel 4 having a 50% commitment outside of London is translating into growth in the indigenous sector in Scotland. And we're bucking a trend in that, which I think is really interesting.
Still only 0.7% of the UK Scottish Indigenous production, which is, given we're 8.3% of the UK's population, is frankly woeful. Lastly, because I know there's other people that come in, Convener, will this I know exactly, will this Leith studio, will it be able to be fully utilised all year round? In other words, do you have not the capacity in the studio, but do you have the productions that will be able to use that? Will it create and generate growth of itself, or is it going to be empty 3 quarters a year because you cannot actually get the productions to use it? How do you feel it is going to work over the years? Thanks, Convener.
Isabel will come back to that point in a second, but I want to respond briefly to your previous comment. I spent the last 20 years working in production. I think I was in studios twice in those 20 years, and once was in Beijing. You know, studios are not the be-all and end-all of production within Scotland. There's a massive factual sector across Scotland. There's a very strong documentary entertainment sector that has grown really healthily across the last 10 years. So studios are not the be-all and end-all. There's also a question around how you're right, you know, the South East has benefited disproportionately from the current boom, but that's because they have the sheds, they have the big spaces. That's what attracts those high-value projects. So this is our opportunity to capture some more of that market. That's what we, you know, Isabel in particular has been working tirelessly on for the last 18 months. So we are aware of that concern. These are moves to address that concern. But you also have to then think about the figures that are reported currently. You know, I think I'd mentioned this last time I appeared in front of this committee with a different hat on. You know, the figures that are published for production are calculated in a way which, you know, I think we all recognise is not complete. You know, there are ways of looking at the value of Screen Scotland that haven't been currently considered. You know, we report a figure of between, let's say, 60 and 90 million a year for production spend. That's an accurate figure. It reflects the methodology that's been adopted up till now, but it doesn't reflect all of the screen activity in Scotland. If you aggregate all the public service broadcaster activity reported in annual reports with the activity we record through the film commissions, with the exhibition sector, for which we're also responsible, you quickly get to a figure that's closer to, well, certainly above 300 million, potentially heading towards £500 million. So there are different ways of looking at this. One of the workflows that we've set in motion since just before I joined is, what is the methodology? What is screen worth to Scotland? And we hope to come back to that in due course.
Okay. Thank you very much. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. Just one final question, possibly on the studio. The announcement was very welcome. It's just to have a better understanding of, so the operator has been appointed. The studio or the space was already used for Avengers Infinity War. It's been used as a studio. What does and you're putting 1 million in, which I think will pay for soundproofing, and you said compliance issues. So I'm trying to understand what the added value of bringing in operators is, given it's a space that's already been used. And one thing I think we discovered when we did the inquiry was the issue about lack of space for post-production and that kind of work. Will the studio in Leith offer that kind of facilities, as well as just a space to film?
Okay. Having an operator who can move forward with the full refurbishment. So in fact, that 1 million is for the initial running costs, remedial works, building compliance, etc. It's not going to touch soundproofing as yet. The building itself is very robust, so as we say, there are a number of productions that are looking to use it to film in without that large-scale refurbishment that we fully anticipate will come further down the line, but tailored to client demand as that demand comes in. Having the expertise of the commercial sector, so Bob Last, a producer of many award-winning films, and indeed has a wider experience in the creative industries, and notably in music production, alongside Jason Connery, who is a filmmaker himself, will be able to attract that private investment. They know how to talk to clients. They are able to negotiate rates and to operate as an actual facility as opposed to a build space on a one-off basis. So this is very much about a strategy going forward that will actively encourage clients into that building, and certainly their intention is to look to private investment in refurbishment as client demand and market forces require it.
And will that then be, so obviously I think the committee would be quite keen to scrutinise how the film should have developed, but would that be the work of then a private company? Would we have, what would our potential or our ability to engage with how that's progressing be?
Well, certainly, you know, they will be in the driving seat, absolutely. You know, this is something that has been facilitated by Screen Scotland, but it was always the intention, of course, through the tender process to find a private sector operator. Like all studios, in the end, it will be driven by the private sector. So, you know, going forward, I'm sure that will be the way in which, you know, they'll be able to come forward.
And our job is to represent all of Scotland and all of the facilities across Scotland. That operator can specifically represent that opportunity in Leith to the global sector.
Thank you. The paper that you provided to us, it does talk about total production spend, and there was, Isabel, you talked about it being a boom time, but it does report that production spend in 2018-19 is estimated at 67 million, which is a decline on the previous year's estimate. What's behind those figures?
Yes, indeed. Well, let me say this. Film's a really lumpy business. It's one or two productions can make a really big difference. And I think what we see in the previous year is two locally driven films that had to be made in Scotland. So that was Trainspotting 2 and Outlaw King, both with very high budgets that were made in Scotland. They both used alternative space because there wasn't a studio, because they really had to be sited in Scotland. We also had Avengers in that year as well. So in a way that was, I guess, the blip. I think what we're all acknowledging is that until we have another large-scale facility such as Wall Park, you know, now we have Leith, that's how growth will come. And without it, it's very, very difficult to grow.
I just wanted to ask finally about the skills strategy. There's been some talk about availability of crew and where crew is based, and the fact that a lot of crew leave Scotland to work elsewhere. How do we, where are we at with the skills strategy? There's obviously a need to build capacity within the sector. When are we going to see the skills strategy?
So I joined 3 months ago. Across that period, I would estimate that roughly 40% of my work has been dedicated to skills development programs. We work continuously with our partners, both our enterprise partners, Highlands Lands Enterprise and Scottish Enterprise, but also Skills Development Scotland, to develop the strategy. It is in a state where I would hope that we will publish it within the summer. At the same point, that has not stopped the work from progressing. So, you know, while we refine the strategy, while we publish various papers, we are constantly kind of dealing with requests, both under the MOUs with the BBC, but also independent of that. So a good example, I think, is the Outlander training programme. So Outlander began filming in Scotland in 2014, and Screen Scotland, Outlander and Screen Skills, which is the national body for skills, have co-funded a traineeship programme across all departments, including camera, costume, design, assistant director, art department, effects and production. Approximately 20 trainees a year go through that programme. The impacts are wider than that, though. They interview roughly 100 people a year. So of those that don't make it onto the training programme, many are offered day contracts and some are offered larger scale contracts. Almost everybody, or the majority of applicants, are also offered access to the training courses. They don't necessarily participate in them, but they're able to attend lectures and hear what's going on. We're currently advertising for a range of roles for the upcoming season within Outlander. So we're looking for production design, concept art, plastering, painting, costume locations. And it's those practical skills that we're going to have to look to develop within the East Coast as well as, you know, across all of Scotland for Leith. that's one example of many. If you look outside the scripted area into unscripted, we work with TRC, which was it's a charity previously originally formed by Channel 4 with a focus on kind of professional development across the TV sector. Their RAD programme helped bring diverse new entrants into the factual TV space, or the unscripted TV space this year. 8 people were put through a process. 7 have found roles within the sector. We're looking to expand that next year. At more senior level, we're working with Screen Skills and the Series Producer Programme. So it's a continuous process of skills development, all of which will, we believe, align with the strategy in due course, but the strategy will follow some of the work and then will inform the work that follows.
And does the skills strategy include any work within the education sector, within schools or within colleges? Or so how do you, when you're talking about transferable skills, whether it's plastering or it's in other areas, how do you encourage people to come in to see it as a career option in film and television? Because we do need to bring a younger generation in, and I'm not sure they see it as a viable opportunity for them at the moment.
Absolutely. We have a film education programme that has about 30 projects going on across Scotland, and I do mean truly across Scotland, far out to the reaches of the Central Belt. We've also worked with our Screen Commission to hire location managers who've gone into schools to turn young school children onto the possibilities of working on film. So we're very alive to the idea that through film education, that's perhaps one of the first points of engagement for young people, with the idea that they might themselves work in our sector. So it's a really key part of it. We have a clear line of sight through our film education team and our skills team. In fact, our head of film education oversees skills. Yeah. So there's, I would say, at Creative Scotland, a very, very clear line there. And I think just to accentuate a point that David's probably already made, but that we, having that Screen Scotland partnership with Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland around the table is our opportunity to really put some muscle behind our skills strategy going forward, that we do absolutely need to look at this as a concerted effort across all of those agencies and across the education system as well. This is a growing sector. Scotland knows it wants to be part of the creative industries boom. These are jobs that are to a certain extent future-proofed. They are fulfilling interesting careers that pay well and are sustainable. It's absolutely critical that we get this right, and we need to do that in a concerted way across all government departments as well as through its agencies.
Skills Development Scotland operate My World of Work, which is a programme of engagement with schools. I'm aware of broadcaster production companies that take an active role in that programme.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. Just to follow up on that, I accept there's lots of good work going on, but it does feel, sort of some of it's a bit sort of sporadic and scattergun. You talked about 30 projects across Scotland, but that's entirely dependent upon local authorities and schools engaging with that programme. Is that right?
Well, I mean, our head of film education has been in post for 20 years. He has incredibly deep connections across Scotland. So in terms of, the appetite from local authorities, those that see the value in individual school teachers, I'm sure that's true that you'll have some that are more passionate than others. But from our perspective, I think it feels pretty coherent. There's always more that could be done, for sure. And I think it's also fair to say that there's a number of networks that allow for collaboration and sharing. So, for example, the work of Film Hub Scotland, which has 4 bases across Scotland, which also allow there to be physical hubs that can draw in the work of film education alongside the festival network, many of whom, notably Glasgow and Edinburgh, have very strong film education programmes that take them out with the capital and Glasgow.
Film School Forest is a good example of one of those activities, but it's also within the, our remit isn't just about production, film and television. Exhibition's a big part of what we do as well. And last year we launched a bespoke fund looking at how we protect the infrastructure or strengthen the infrastructure for cinema and exhibition across the whole of Scotland, in the non-commercial, in the local, so not looking at necessarily the Odeons or the Views, but looking at our kind of local cinemas, local film clubs, local film societies and film festivals. It's a £1.6 million pound fund called the Cinema Commitment Fund. It's currently in its 3rd and final round. We are oversubscribed. We've had lots of requests from across Scotland, but if you don't mind, I'm just going to list some of the kind of work that we've done in a very cohesive way, and I think that's something also worth kind of stressing. I joined Screen Scotland from industry. I joined a team that I'm, genuinely very impressed by. They're a diligent, proactive, informed and engaged team who know the sector and know their elements within the sector. We'll come on to talk, I'm sure, about how we're changing and developing our team shortly, but that team designed the Cinema Equipment Fund, and that's delivered the future-proofing of CCA Cinema in Glasgow, improvement to cinema facilities across Shetland, including the replacement of and updating of projectors in Lerwick's Mario venue, a full upgrade of cinema equipment in the Eastgate Centre in Peebles, the installation of 4K laser projector and sound system in McRoberts in Stirling, and the KIP Cinema project run by the KIP Community Initiative in Inverclyde, with an upgrade of their existing and outdated cinema equipment to provide an inclusive, accessible, affordable and family-friendly cinema venue. So we take a whole Scotland view, and we take a quite coherent view.
So you say that fund was oversubscribed. What's missed out?
Well, there are applications which we may not be able to support in this round. We will consider, if we renew that fund, if there is sufficient demand, we will look at that. But there are also applications that potentially don't fall within the remit. So at the moment, we have applications to a greater value than the fund that remains. But we will look at that at the end of the process to see if we need to renew.
Okay. And in terms of, can you place a value on how far oversubscribed it is?
We have roughly £750,000 remaining, and I think we have 1.2 million left over. But if you want me to clarify those figures after the fact, I can. They're not on the piece of paper in front of me.
Okay, that's fine. In terms of working with agencies, you've mentioned Highlands and Islands and Scottish Enterprise, but I'm looking from my own constituency interest. The South of Scotland Enterprise Agency will be operational from April. Will you be engaging with them on the skills strategy to make sure those living in the South of Scotland don't miss out?
Yeah, they've just recently joined our business development working group, and we expect them to join both the skills working group and the partnership delivery group in due course.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ross.
Thank you. I'd like to frame my questions around the business plan that you published this time last year for the 2019-20 plan. But just to start off with, it'd be useful if you could confirm, is that as an annual plan going to be replicated again this year? Is there going to be a 2020-2021 plan? And is there an end-of-year update on the plan that was published this time last year?
Our plan going forward is to have a strategic document that will, again, outline what our plans are, and I think we'll look at that for the next 2 years, won't we? That's our plan, yeah.
What's the timescale for publication of that document?
Across the summer, I would say, because of the alterations we're making within the team, the 1920 plan will roll forward for a period.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. In that case, just to drill down some of the specifics in it and going back to the point around the studio, when you were last with us and we just had this plan, I asked around the KPI around studio capacity was to get this new studio operational, so that's now, and by April, so that's now been achieved, congratulations. But when I asked around additional studio capacity and what Screen Scotland's strategic role is in overall capacity growth, you said that there were other performance indicators sitting underneath that singular KPI around a new studio. I was wondering if you could, because we didn't have an opportunity then, if you could expand a little bit on what those other performance indicators around studio capacity are and what progress has been made towards them so far.
I don't have the detail on what the KPIs are under that particular heading in front of me at the moment. I'm very happy to write to you and confirm that after the fact. But my understanding of how we're developing the studio sector is, as we outlined earlier, there are different requirements across different genres and different levels of production. So we're taking a kind of whole Scotland view, looking at the spaces that already exist. I think I've already mentioned the facilities in Stornoway and Skye. There's the Martin facility. There's also PQ within Glasgow. So that is actually quite a useful space to think about because it's an entertainment space. It's also fully occupied because the BBC is very busy. So, how we expand the capacity for entertainment spaces across Scotland, which have different requirements. They have an audience often, which a film studio doesn't require. So you need car parking for an audience as well as the production itself. There are potentially security implications as a result of having an audience there. So we're engaging actively with the industry, with stakeholders, both across the UK and within Scotland, but also really strongly with Glasgow City Council, who, I think you'll remember the G4C4 campaign. That really formed very strong connective tissue between Glasgow and the sector, and we continue to build upon that.
Thanks. And moving forward again, but sticking with the KPIs, I was wondering if you could explain why 2016-17 is used for the baseline, for example, on production spend. Is that simply because that was the period from which what became Screen Scotland was established?
Indeed.
Grand. And the production spend KPI, specifically around doubling spend, I was wondering, is there an equivalent KPI there specifically for spend by Indigenous Scottish production companies? So I'm aware of there's a separate indicator around moving from 2 to 6 Scottish companies in the top 50 with turnover over 10 million. But is there a KPI for the overall production spend for Indigenous companies?
There isn't. But as you know, from our previous engagements, my previous engagements with this committee, I came from working with Impact within the independent production sector. And across the last 10 years, my mantra has been from, not in. Ofcom's current rules, even the revised rules, look to production from in Scotland, which doesn't require to be Indigenous. I've constantly campaigned for production from Scotland, about representation, about IP and value being held within our production sector in Scotland. There were recent changes on that, so they have been helpful. There's also a new authenticity of approach from the public service broadcasters. So while we don't have a KPI specifically attached to that, that is where a lot of our work goes. And if you look at the way we structure our funds, 10% of our funding is targeted towards productions that come into Scotland. The rest is targeted to work within, from within the Scottish production community. The production growth fund's the only fund that's specifically designed to draw projects into Scotland that would not otherwise be filmed here. But even that fund is accessed by Scottish-based production companies.
The production spend section in the 2019 plan mentions, when you're talking about these targets, this will include developing the methodology to identify production spend in film and television. So touching on the points that have been made a number of times previously around data availability here. Could you just give us a quick update on your progress towards developing and having an agreed methodology there?
On this earlier, and it's a complicated nut to crack. I was at an event recently where somebody told me Burns is worth 20 million a year to the Scottish economy, and I'd love to know how that was calculated. We're working with the BBC, we're working with the National Audit Office, we're working with various bodies to come up with what we think is a robust methodology for the value of Screen Scotland. As I say, I think it's somewhere between the 300 million and 500 million figure, depending on how you cut it. That has to be something that we agree on as a partnership, but also with the sector. So that we have a team within Screen Scotland, Creative Scotland called Knowledge and Research, and they're working on this right now. It's an active topic. It's been personally a bugbear of mine for a number of years, and I think it is really important that we as a nation, a government, a parliament, we know that Scotland is worth, that what Screen is worth to Scotland. The point made earlier about Glasgow and the importance of the sector in Glasgow isn't lost upon me. It's not lost on Glasgow City Council either. If you look at that figure, however you divide it, the majority of the value currently attaches to Glasgow City economy or the Greater Glasgow area economy. We're a pan-Scottish agency. We have to look at developing opportunities across the whole of Scotland. I've been very active in the Made Out of London campaign, within the independent sector. There is an argument for Made Out of the Central Belt, for how we spread that value across the whole of the country.
And again, just looking at timescales, is there timescale for your team having something agreed? I understand that then needs taken out to the sector, to other stakeholders, agencies, etc. What timescale are you working to here to get that methodology agreed? Because that's incredibly important long term, even beyond a lot of the stuff. It takes us up to 22, 23. The methodology like that, that's got much longer term implications. So having something agreed as soon as possible is good, but we need to make sure that whatever's agreed is something that has absolute buy-in across every stakeholder.
That's exactly the tension. So I think we're working across 2021 to deliver that, so that when we report our figures at the end of that period, we'll report in both consistently on the measure we currently use, but then also the new measure.
If I may just add to that, I think that's an incredibly important point to make, that we do have to get this right. And the reason why we have a benchmark for 2016 is I don't think anyone would appreciate us changing the goalposts for our own targets. And that's certainly not the point of this exercise, but certainly getting it right for many years to come, it has got to be absolutely key here.
Thanks. And moving to organisational issues, the submission that you sent in advance, we had it in advance of last week's session with the industry, it was very useful. But it mentioned, in terms of your organisational structure and staffing, it talked about a restructuring process, which raised the question for us of restructuring an organisation or a unit that is still really quite new. And I was wondering if you could just clarify if that's an issue of language. Is this essentially the completion of an initial structuring process, or have you already got to a point where actually there was a wider review and restructuring required?
Well, I think what you're seeing now reflects the aspirations that were put forward by the SSLG and by yourselves in terms of that specialisation, that requirement for industry expertise. So the key part of the restructure, reshaping, if you like, because as David says, we love our team. You know, the people who work at Screen Scotland, who were formerly at the Screen Unit, are incredibly diligent, intelligent people who understand and really care about the sector and work tirelessly to support it. But the structure of the team was such that we had rather a generalist approach, if you will, which to my mind, when we've, in fact, you've done the work here, you know, looking at those key areas such as business development support, talent development, audience development, how do we best support those when we have a team of people who are working across all of those areas? To my mind, the way in which we build deeper, stronger connections with industry, the way in which we formulate much more nuanced approaches of strategy was through reshaping those teams, and indeed where we felt that there were need to bring in additional expertise, that we have the freedom to do so, and we have the resource to do so. So to outline these changes, I mean, I don't want to sort of repeat what's in the submission, but we've already appointed a head of audience development who'll start towards the end of April. That's somebody who's extremely well known to the sector, who can allow us to really shape and bear down and prioritise audience development. We have a business and market development person coming in. Now, that's something that we wouldn't have put in place in 2016 because it's come directly out of the work that we've done with ECOS, with Scottish Enterprise, to look at how do we best serve the needs of the sector through business development support. And we're currently in a live recruitment for a head of scripted and a head of unscripted who will be able to provide a clear line of sight through the talent development pathways on both of those, whether they, you know, so rather than having sort of film and TV, the way that we see things are that unscripted and scripted for Scotland, a country of our size, there will be many more commonalities between those two pathways than there are between, let's say, film and TV. We know that we want to see some convergence there. And finally, a post for head of production, which will allow us to be much more hands-on and robust and helpful and supportive for productions through budgeting and scheduling correctly, and it'll allow us to, among other things, intervene much more early on with productions in that first feature space.
Thanks. And just two brief final questions that I'll roll into one, because I'm conscious of time. On that point on head of production, that seems like quite a significant role to still be recruiting for now. So I was wondering if you could just clarify why was a role like that, which to, you know, in layman's terms for folk like us seems pretty critical, why was that not something that was prioritised far earlier? Why are we just getting someone in post now? But on this, the overall recruitment staff structuring, to us, it looks like, understanding is the staff team will total 32, is that's roughly what you're looking at. There's a lot of heads of, it seems potentially quite top heavy, though we don't have a full understanding of the staff structure. It'd be useful if you could outline, what is the ratio of senior staff to officer level staff within the team?
So starting with head of production, there hasn't been a head of production for, you know, when we came into the structure. I don't think it was a recommendation of SSLG. However, I see a role, and it comes out of my previous experience, where I see that, you know, even though the individual officers have been playing the role of a production executive alongside the other roles that they play across our slate, I see the need for our sector to have a bolstering of support around the budgeting and the scheduling process, which will allow us to become much more responsive to the needs of production as they go through that process. And I think in particular, if I look at how we are able to respond to what industry has told us very strongly, and I agree with them, that we need to be more confident about coming on board earlier on in the financing of productions rather than letting the market decide. And I think in order to be confident in our own decisions and allow us to do more due diligence, we need somebody who is full-time on scrutinising the production decisions that we make. Secondly, we are building in a number more heads. They're going to be very hands-on. I mean, this is not a sort of, you know, layer of management that are going to be sort of, you know, bossing around a very, you know, diminishing number of Indians. This is really a team that will be very closely knitted together, and will be experts themselves, and will have, in most cases, small numbers, 1 or 2 officers working beneath them. But at the moment, I would say that we have rather a flat structure, and that's not really working either.
We currently have, I think, the plan is we move to 6 heads across the unit. with myself and Isabel as director and executive director. Above those, there's a number of roles underneath, but obviously the 32 headcount in total. We draw from within expertise from within Creative Scotland for HR, for comms, for IT, and you're very ably supported in all of those areas, I have to say. But we also draw expertise from our partner agencies, and that is genuinely a day in, day out process.
So trying to do...
We've got a few other members
Yeah,
that
of
still
course.
haven't come in, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on. Annabelle?
Good morning. Turning to the issue of funding in general terms, what is the... is it the case that the totality of Creative Scotland's funding for the screen industry in Scotland is administered through Screen Scotland?
Yes, I'd say it is. So we have our budget. I mean, I think perhaps in addition to our budget allocation, there are a number of regularly funded organisations which sit within the Creative Scotland portfolio. However, where those are film or, I mean, I'm not sure that there are any TV focused regularly funded organisations, but those have lead officers that are drawn from the Screen Scotland team. If that helps.
Creative Scotland has the money, and for the screen industry in Scotland, it goes via yourselves at Screen Scotland, and you then disperse that through various funding streams. Will that disbursement information be published, and when? So you get money, you then disperse. So is at that level, will that information be made public?
Yeah, I mean, the allocation, so regularly funded organisations, I mean, I think we're about to go into year 3 of those regularly funded organisations, so, and that will be part of the annual review. Those amounts are set. Disbursement, I mean, the physical act of handing over the money will happen essentially through the financial team at Creative Scotland, as it does for all of our awards, but the engagement with those RFOs happens through the respective officer at Screen Scotland. If I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
Yeah, every award is regularly published on our website.
Would that include then information about the types of projects, the organisations or individuals receiving the funding? So all
From
that
memory,
is broken
yes,
down?
all of that, yeah.
Yes, we publish regularly on the Creative Scotland website all of the awards that are made, and yes, exactly, from memory, its date, its amount, its company. There are and projects, very few individuals, I think, that come through the funding schemes that we do, but I guess it does...
Markets and festivals.
Markets and festivals, yeah. Even then it tends to be, I think, the company rather than the individual whose name is on the website.
Okay, I understand in terms of the global funding that there was an expectation that £20 million would be spent in the financial year 2018-19 in terms of film and screen sector. Is that what happened? Or?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, some of those awards, obviously some production will straddle more than 1 year, or we'll make commitments in this year that will go across next year, but that's our working budget, isn't it?
And that also, previous periods also roll into that period. So it's, within each budget year, that is the figure to which we're operating.
Okay. Turning to the issue of the Indigenous producer, when we met with various stakeholders last week, and you'll probably have seen the evidence taken, it seemed that there was support for the Canadian model, whereby I understand support for incoming productions is contingent on partnering with an Indigenous producer. I also understand that may be the case in France. So is this something that Screen Scotland is considering?
Well, the Canadian model is interesting. I mean, I think Canada has a very particular situation, being as it is next to the largest producer of content in the world, the US, and has to sort of, shape itself in response to that particular market condition. The Canadian system, there are a number of funding streams there. At the federal level, there are 2 separate tax credits, actually. It's even built into their tax system, where you have a production service credit and an Indigenous credit. So Canada will always have a production service company attached to that federal tax credit. We don't in Scotland at this current point have a network of production service companies. Given the scale of our company, I think the fact that we are always in a situation with, if we're talking about production funding, and in fact any of our funding, will always involve Scottish people. I think, as David pointed out, the 10% of our funding, which is the Production Growth Fund, which is there to attract inward production, very much embedded in the DNA of that is the fact that Scottish crew will be working on that production. Typically, there is a Scottish line producer, but we are also aware that because we are able to be small, and every award is a negotiation whereby we are very aware of who's available crew-wise, that we're not imposing things that would otherwise sort of knock out a production from coming, and that we're able to make sure that the best possible opportunities are available for crew. And that's part of the deal that we do with every company that comes in for a Production Growth Fund award. So I think that in this situation, the flexibility that we have, which is allied to our market intelligence and our knowledge of crew, actually serves us very well at this point.
I think that, you know, if you look at all of the funds that we operate in our totality, so the Production Growth Fund is separate. It's a way that we compete globally. That's one of the levers we have to pull in that global market. So we win Fast and Furious 9. It comes to Edinburgh. That is then, you can watch the trailer currently on YouTube, and it features lovely shots of the city. There are other projects currently filming in the West Coast, which we won't mention because they've not been publicly announced, but you know, they've been in the press. That again is a great advert for Scotland, but that's a competitive process, and if we cannot say, it's not really competent for any smaller nation to say to the likes of Universal, you know, you can come make Fast and Furious 9 here. We'll help you with production support. You must return a certain multiplier into the Scottish economy, but you must also work with a Scottish production company, because they will work with line producers, they'll work with heads of department, they'll work with teams from within Scotland, but Universal will not co-produce that project with somebody else. So if we impose that, we wouldn't win that business, is what it boils down to. You also then, if you look at our other funds, like the Broadcast Content Fund, we recently, well, I think it's in our written submission, but that fund is targeted towards Scottish production companies with, you know, that's a capitalised phrase, it's defined within the criteria. It's also open to companies from within the EU EEA area, because that's how, you know, the current rules, but they have to be involved in a meaningful co-production with a Scottish company, and we've set out what a meaningful co-production is. All of the outputs have to qualify as Scottish content under the Ofcom criteria. So the majority of our funding is targeted towards Indigenous companies, or requires a co-production with a Scottish company. The exception is the Production Growth Fund, and that's specifically designed for that purpose, to win international business.
Okay, I thank you for that comprehensive answer. I guess I understand the competing interests here, but I just thinking back on the evidence session last week, it's perhaps then there's a lack of confidence, perhaps, that the Indigenous sector will be duly taken into account to the widest extent possible. The message that we seemed to be getting last week was that they're not confident in your processes, that they will end up getting some work. And that seems to me to be a short-sighted approach, because we've got to build up, surely, the Indigenous sector.
There were some interesting omissions in some of the evidence last week. I ran an Indigenous production company until October last year. I was the National Director for PAC, the Producers Alliance for Cinema and Television in Scotland, the body that represents producers across the whole of the UK. You know, as I mentioned at the start, there was one project referenced by one of the panel members last week, a £4 million production that's recently been won by them. It's actually a co-production between 3 Scottish companies. We facilitated that project through development. That wasn't mentioned by the panellists. We are part funding the production. That wasn't mentioned by the panellists. So I could lead you back to various other examples in terms of the evidence last week, and where there were omissions which could easily be challenged.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, it might be helpful then if you could write to the committee with that information, because that you're saying that we've only got part of the jigsaw and we're missing an important part, according to your perspective. So if we had that missing part of the jigsaw, it would help inform our views. Thank you. Sorry, Isabel, did you want? No,
I'm really happy to do that. Makes
okay,
sense.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. Stuart.
Thank you. Just kind of follows on a wee bit from Annabelle's questions. On the issue of productions and producers, there has been the issue that's raised before and also last week on the issue of commissioning power. And that then leads on to another couple of issues, but what are you doing to work with the broadcasters in Scotland to actually increase the productions in Scotland and also have a greater output for Scotland?
My work, again, for a long period, and part of the reason why I've been brought into Screen Scotland is my knowledge and kind of expertise within the TV sector. The BBC is obviously in a difficult position at the moment, but I think we would all recognise that, and this we've discussed in this room before, levels of licence fee reinvestment by the BBC across the UK are not equal. There's a disparity in how the licence fee is reinvested within Scotland in particular. It's changed, the sums have generally risen, but the gap has remained consistent. We would like to see more money spent on the BBC Scotland channel. We'd like more money to be spent on BBC on content from Scotland for all of the networks, for the BBC, Channel 4, ITV, Channel 5. Channel 5, interestingly, are actually very good. You know, they over-deliver on their non-existent quotas. They have no specific Scottish quota, but they regularly work with Scottish production companies. It's something that's noted within the sector. We recently, there's a forum called the TV Working Group, which is a good space for the sector to meet with the Scottish Government and its agencies, Scottish Enterprise, Screen Scotland and others. One of the points raised there most recently was that there were no factual commissioners within Scotland. There'd been a few people had moved jobs, some had joined STV, some had gone elsewhere, and that left a vacancy. We picked that up. Within 48 hours, we had responses back from both the BBC and Channel 4 about how they were addressing this. So there is an authenticity of approach by the broadcasters that wasn't there a year ago, 2 years ago. It has changed. They do want to address the concerns. I'm actively involved in negotiating the MOU with Channel 4 that we hope to launch later this summer. I could give you a more precise date, but I don't necessarily want to be tied down to it at the moment. That's connected to skills development, company development and market development. The job that Isabel mentioned earlier is our new head of business and market development. And I'm really conscious, having come from the sector, that you can stimulate business capacity. If you don't stimulate market capacity at the same point, it's not purposeless, but it's suboptimal in its output. So working with the PSBs in particular, because we have their rules that Ofcom have imposed upon them to work within Scotland, we're trying to draw more commissioning power to Scotland. We want to disrupt London to London patterns of commissioning. We want commissioners based in Scotland. We want commissioning budgets based in Scotland.
Well, that's interesting what you said, and I think it's something that the committee need to look at, because we've heard in the past from BBC, certainly a year ago and beyond, that it's an area that they have been working on to try to improve it internally in their organisation. But what you've just said there seems to kind of conflict somewhat with that.
I think it doesn't conflict, it builds upon. I think that they are genuinely engaged in the process of trying to alter the way they commission content across the UK. And there is an authenticity in that approach that wasn't there previously. But it's a journey. And actually some of those individual jobs are quite hard to replace. I won't name individuals because it's not appropriate, but you can't just pick a commissioner off a shelf and pop them into a job, especially if you want that person to be based in Scotland. Historically, they haven't been here. But interestingly, we now have, because of the Channel 4 hub, because of the work with the BBC, we have an internal competitive market for commissioning posts within Scotland. That adds a slight delay into the process in terms of how you recruit them. But the aim is definitely to draw more people up here.
How does this then affect the issue of casting agencies? I'm aware that there have been some concerns that particularly BBC productions have been utilising casting agencies from external from Scotland, as compared to using that resource that's already here.
I think that's a concern that applies not just to casting agencies, but to all levels and grades within productions. As a former producer, you'd often win the commissioner, and then the next conversation would be, could you work with X, Y, and Z? They're all based from the southeast. So that's for the production companies in Scotland to kind of win those arguments. We help them wherever we can.
May I just add to that, certainly the work of the Screen Commission, when we are very regularly bringing production companies up to Scotland to do location recce's, for example, to look at whether they can base in Scotland, one of the first pieces of advice that they will have is to engage a Scottish line producer, because it's from that line producer that all of those other conversations can flow. So on quite a strategic level, we build that in, we build the Scottishness in, with that Scottish expertise, and that's really where you want to start.
There's various initiatives that we have set in motion in the first quarter of this year, which would have brought commissioners to Scotland. Coronavirus, I'm afraid, is slightly disrupting our plans at present.
Okay. I just got a question regarding the new studio. Is there a potential to have, just in the short term, for that to put pressure upon the existing studios that are there, particularly in and around the Glasgow area, bearing in mind the 65% of the workforce living around the Glasgow area? So potential to kind of put pressure upon them and subsequently then can increase costs, because there is as you've already indicated, I think they used the word, it's a fledgling industry. So until we get more people into the sector, and then is there a potential that costs could then increase and additional pressures apply?
Costs of the studio itself or on crew?
Costs of staff and costs of hiring, and to get people to go and work into the new studio.
That's not something that we would see as an outcome of this at all. I mean, it should be said that the Glasgow-based crews are working really hard right now. They have a lot of activity, a lot of production. We're actually looking at a very active sector right now. I think that the reality is the productions that will come in, we've seen those numbers, we've seen what the production spend looks like with like for like with production, even if we know there's, further to our methodology, more to come. We know that there is going to be, as there was when Outlander came in, a need to crew up in Scotland. And we know that part of that will come through more people coming back to Scotland, and we know it's going to involve a concerted effort to build more skills. But I think, again, I mean, it's a colloquial term, but if I can say horses for courses, we will, that production will take what it needs, and we will grow with that production. And I think, in a way, coming back to the skills question, there's only so much you can do unless you have a production to base things around. That's really what we've been waiting for as well.
And there's a commercial consideration there as well. Crews work within industry guidelines, within industry agreements. They're back to there are various structures within which they have to work. There is a commercial negotiation, but there's also there's the potential to draw in people from across the whole of the UK to Scotland. Some of those people will potentially end up working here long term, potentially staying here. That will augment our capacity.
Okay. My final question just is regarding the Cinema Equipment Fund. Can you send the committee basically all the information that was represented in terms of all the recipients through this
Yes,
fund?
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Just wondering, we do have a few now which sort of show a little bit of the geographic spread, but you might want to see.
There's more.
We don't have much time left, so
yes.
maybe we shouldn't repeat that.
Okay,
absolutely.
fine.
If you can just, I've got some supplementaries to Stuart's question, actually, in terms of the BBC spend, and specifically for you, David. The BBC repeatedly say that when they evaluate what is a Scottish production, they are extremely robust. Obviously, people in the sector dispute that. Do you think they're extremely robust?
Are increasingly robust is probably the way I would put it. When we've discussed this previously, I certainly had questions for all of the PSBs, not just the BBC. The BBC tends to be the focus of a lot of this discussion, but it's not just them.
Yeah.
There's been a sea change. I think Ofcom's rules didn't go as far as I would have liked them to go. We did see a tightening up of what is and is not a substantive base, what is and is not a senior person. There was some very useful kind of clarification around the guidelines themselves, the purpose of those rules and what they're intended to deliver. That has fed through. My conversations prior to taking up this role, but also subsequent to taking up this role with the broadcasters, but also with the sector. Yesterday I met a producer, I won't say who or where. They had just won exactly the kind of project we would like them to win from one of the PSBs. I'm trying to work out what I can and can't say as I say this. We want returning formats from Scotland across genres. So that could be returning drama series, returning factual series, returning entertainment series. We want them from Scotland, not just in Scotland. So we want those to be Scottish companies that win that. I'm increasingly seeing that as the trend. It is Scottish companies, owned and operated.
Yeah, and you said that before. How can you use your new position to keep up the pressure there, particularly since we're going to have a new head of BBC Scotland and a new Director General? How can you use your new position to keep that pressure up?
Through dialogue, through constantly returning to those points, to making it clear that when we invest in a project, we are interested in production from Scotland under many of our funds, that we want the outputs to be Scottish qualifying, and we are paying attention to that. One of my first actions when I came into the post was to go out and meet some of the companies that I think in my previous role I may have had question marks over as to how secure their Scottish bases are. I'm happy to report that a lot of them are here for the duration, have been here for a few years, have put down roots and employed kind of senior editorial people from within the Scottish community.
If I may add to that, I think it's our role at Screen Scotland to be building up the talent sector, where these ideas are coming from, and share that intelligence with the commissioning teams at the PSBs as well, building strong relationships across the head of scripted, unscripted as well, to build that confidence.
We can't tell the BBC or Channel 4 how to spend their money, but we can certainly tell them how we would prefer to see them spend their money, and where our strategic aims and objectives align with theirs, that's what we draw them back
Particularly
to.
if you're putting some of the money in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Kenneth.
Very much, Convener. I mean, I concur with some of these recent questions. I think every year we express a concern that you know, a lot more money is raised in Scotland from licence fees than is actually spent in Scotland, even if we account for network spend. But there's just two brief questions I was wanting to ask. One was basically, we heard last week from one of our panellists about the need to have market and broadcasting brokerage to improve access to key people in organisations ranging from Netflix to the BBC. And Isabel Davis, you mentioned market intelligence earlier on. So I'm just wondering what assistance actually is provided to allow people to get through that door, Indigenous companies in particular?
Yeah, so we have a Markets and Festivals Fund, which I think it's fair to say, I'm not sure about Eric, but I think the other three have certainly availed of that Markets Fund to go to international markets, when those physical markets, such as on the film side, Cannes, Toronto, Berlin. On the TV side, MIPCOM would be a key example of that. We also support a number of documentary festivals. That is entirely up to the Indigenous producer to decide where their strategy goes, and they apply for some money, and we will disperse that to them. We've also run other programs, such as Market Leaders in the past, which has striven to build strategic support, and that's something that we will, I think, look to sharpen up quite considerably when we have our head of business and market development in post next month. So in terms of the travel grants, absolutely it's there, and then in terms of the relationships that we hold, the fact that we are working actively across the development of projects, we are able to introduce directly those companies and to provide that market insight and support.
Because there was a concern that that's not happening. So if I want to produce a
that's
company...
going to be in the letter to you, I think, as well.
Okay, right, that's good. Because if I've got a production I want and I want to speak to Netflix, it's how I actually speak to that individual. I think that's a key issue. I think, obviously, people...
event during the Glasgow Film Festival just last week, where we had the senior team, the head of production, head of physical production for Netflix in the UK, and colleagues, so senior people across the Netflix team within the UK, came to Glasgow, met with 50 plus members of the production community, heads of departments generally. It was in part to make sure they knew each other. It was in part to demonstrate the strength and depth of our talent. Okay. And that worked really well. We also had last month in Edinburgh, we had the Move Summit, which is an animation VFX, special effects focused event that drew in people from Pixar, Unreal, Disney's animation studios, Netflix, and Industrial Light and Magic. Again, we supported that event. That allowed interaction directly with those organisations.
Excellent.
If I may add to that, I think it's one thing providing the fora for these events to take place, whether that's international fora or creating that space within Scotland, but we need to equip people with the tools, whether that's, you know, a producer who thinks that Netflix might want their show, making sure that they have indeed got something that is ready to show to Netflix, but be in the quality of the content and in the presentation. So that's also a really key part of our role, and it's also with regard to our funding, balancing the need for Indigenous stories to be told with that of co-production. So we've had, through the Film Development and Production Fund, 2 productions this year. One was a UK-Australian co-production made by Black Camel Films, Arabella Pagecroft, and the other being a Scottish-Belgian-French production called Wise Blood, which is Barry Carrera, a production company based in Glasgow. So, you know, I think it's equipping people with the tools to go out there, that they have something to offer the international market, which, you know, is that business of having a strategy with many moving parts to it.
And Fallen for Figure, which was the Australian co-production, also connected directly to the Conservatoire in Glasgow, and it drew in talent from within their team.
Okay. And lastly, just on the issue of finance, it was mentioned, is there a possibility that businesses can get soft loans, because often there's a real difficulty in actually having the finance to actually go, you know, get even to first base. So, for example, we were also told last week that it's very difficult for people to get their first film. You know, obviously, companies who are commissioning want someone who's got experience, but if you don't actually get your first film made, you don't have any experience. Particularly, it was pointed out for women directors. So, is there any emphasis going to be on first film producers, particularly women? Will there be soft loans, and how generally do you help companies, Indigenous companies, access, for example, private finance, so that they can actually put that together? Because I might be an excellent filmmaker, but that doesn't mean I know how to really you know, deal with the finance aspect of it. So there's obviously issues there where we have different skills required. I'm just wondering how you actually
Absolutely. Okay.
assist with these
no,
areas.
no, quite. I think the issue of that key first feature film is something that we've been deliberating on with the sector over the last few months, and it's certainly something that our new structure is there to help us support better. The other thing we mentioned in our submission is that we have, we're in the process of recruiting a partner to re-energise the pre-first feature part of our talent development pipeline. Currently, we have the Scottish Film Talent Network. We will, from the start of next financial year, have a new partner who will respond to what we learnt through the first 4 years of that programme around the types of support that are needed by writers, directors and producers to get to the point where they're ready to make a feature film. That's in terms of their craft, the artistic vision, but also, as you've pointed out, the need to have within that team of writer, director, producer, the expertise that not only allows them to produce and finance the film, but to succeed in conveying that the vision that they have to make the film, that the creative side of that process, marrying with the financial acumen to make the film, and making sure within that new structure of a talent development programme that we have a clear line of sight with what's then available at Screen Scotland to support the people who emerge from that programme ready to make their first feature, and that we're able to support that fully, indeed to be on the front foot with supporting, coming in first as a financier. We are never going to be able to fully fund anything. We are, that state aid rules for you, and in any case, this is a mass media project. Even when on low budget, that's still a lot of money compared with any other type of artistic endeavour. We want to work with the grain of audiences and with the market, and we think our filmmakers should as well. So the process of standing behind our very strong talent, supporting them, giving them the tools that they need. Maybe with, if you think of a tricycle with its stabilizers on, that's the role that we should be there to perform, and that's what we're bolstering in terms of our team internally.
Soft loans, sorry?
Soft loans then. So the money that we have effectively is a soft loan, so equity that comes through through development, so the development process being everything from that initial idea, optioning the material, through to late stage development, which is the budgeting, financing, casting elements of the project before you get to the production financing stage. That is the funding that you get already from Screen Scotland, which takes the form of equity in the case of the Broadcast Content Fund and the Film Development and Production Fund, of which the production company will have an equity corridor if the money recoups. So I think, we do also look to other types of finance. There are financial transactions that are available from Scottish Government. There are banks who are looking around the space. In the end, what I think we know from the sector is that loans, actual loans, which are sort of hard and fast loans that have to be repaid back by somebody. In the case of financial transactions, that would be Screen Scotland if the loan is defaulted upon. So not that soft in the end. We're aware that, you do need risk money, and that's always the most tricky money to have. Certainly within the expertise that David holds for TV and I hold for film, and within the team, we are already in a position to help advise on financing and certainly have the relationships to, push those producers if they need support to the sales companies, the distributors, the other types of financiers in the market who could come, and indeed Netflix, who might come on board to finance their projects.
I have to wind up, unfortunately.
Yeah,
we're over time.
Convener,
And one area, a really critical area that I feel that we haven't really explored in the time, because apologies, we were running behind because of our previous session, was the relationship with Scottish Enterprise, which our committee recommended should be cut out and you guys should get the money. That's obviously something that people in the sector repeatedly raise, and the stakeholders raised it last week, and there are specific issues around what replaces the Focus Fund and so on. I think I'll write to you from the committee to put some of those questions, and certainly questions that we'll be raising with the Cabinet Secretary now that she also has responsibility for Scottish Enterprise. So we're hopeful as a committee that perhaps we might be able to take forward some of the difficulties that have been highlighted in the past. But I'll put that to you in writing if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So thank you very much for coming in to see us today. And we'll now move into private session.